I should congratulate you for this wonderful conference. We shall talk about the spiritual dimension and sustainability in the midst of social challenges. We shall hear the papers of His Eminence Gregory, Metropolitan of Cameroon, and Mrs. Stavros Fotiou, who is a theologian teaching at the University of Cyprus. Nonetheless, regrettably, he will not attend in person, so we shall hear a videotaped version of his talk. I would like to convey to you the blessings and prayers of His Beatitude Patriarch Theodoros of Alexandria, who has asked me to represent him at this conference. This is the first time we show our presence here, and it makes it possible for Africa to be heard. So I thank you very much for giving me the possibility of being with you these few days and of sharing your experiences on how to deal with human pain, with the pain of those who lie in sickness. And it is truly a mystery, all this effort to rekindle hope when one is sick. And the underlying reality is that you cannot get anything from someone who has nothing. So if we don't spread out the truth of the hope in our faith, it is impossible to rekindle other people's hopes or to orientate those who are suffering to that side. In his Sermon on the Mount, the Lord beatified the poor in spirit and declared that theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So this deals with what happens after the second coming, but there are other beatitudes where the payout comes not in the far beyond, but in the present century, such as beatified, blessed are the merciful, because they shall find mercy. But there is nothing that might justify a thought that we do not need to show compassion. Africa is a field of social challenges where colonialism continues in two shapes, namely economic sanctions and the in situ presence of lending banks that prolong penury and the delay of growth. Widespread penury is an outcome of an insufficient health and education system. There is no health care or education given without consideration. And public health may be found in the major conurbations, but not out in the rural areas. And there is also a lack of mass transport and mass communication. That means that it is really difficult to have access to hospitals. All this is happening in a society that keeps alive practices and prejudices of the past, involving healers, magicians, exorcists, itinerant priests of various makeshift churches and confessions, and all that cultivates charlatanism and belief in demons and spirits, and there is also the practice of incubation, where people have to spend the night in specific precincts, where the suggestion is that sacrifice, magic, and snake oil approaches will give people what they're asking for. So that means that we have to make a huge effort to lend a spiritual dimension to the entire situation. Or, in the midst of these social challenges, we need to find a way to revive and maintain any shards of hope and cultivate them in a sort of nursery. I believe the way to do this is found in the phrase of Italo Calvino, who was an Italian of Cuban extraction, who in his book Invisible Cities, towards the end, says this: the hell of the living is not something out in the future. If there is such a thing as hell, it is the hell that we experience right here, the hell that we inhabit day by day, the hell that we form with our coexistence. There are two ways for us not to suffer. The first is easy for the many, to accept hell and to be part of it until they end up not being able to see it at all. The other one, the second one, is a dangerous way and requires constant vigilance and will to learn. Namely, it is seeking to understand and to recognize who and what within hell is not of hell, and to give that duration, to give it the space to exist. After these introductory thoughts, relating also to what Calvino says, I'd like to share with you some of my experiences in the field of mission in Cameroon, so that you can get an idea of the societal makeup of African reality. First experience, when I first visited Africa, Uganda, that was 20 years ago, I suffered a sort of cultural shock, as was only to be expected, and I found myself landing in a reality that I'd never known of previously. The only information I had up till then was from occasional snippets of the news or coverage in various mass media. Now, what I saw before me became etched in my memory and heart, namely the huge effort made by a people who come from a very ancient cultural situation and that seeks to remain upright in the modern-day Babel of ideas and vested interests and injustice. It's a chaos, in other words. 13 years ago, I had the blessing to be invited by the church to minister to a small set of countries in Central Western Africa, based in Cameroon. My ministry confined itself in Cameroon, which is a peaceable land, thanks be to God, but recently Boko Haram have become quite active. Of course, it's one thing to go to a country as a visitor and a different thing altogether to have to take action there. So, as regards health, what I found was that the health status of people there depends on the financial situation of each patient and their family. Even if there is the financial wherewithal, the local health system cannot treat many diseases. Hospitalization for chronic patients is something totally unknown, and in mental patients, it's archaic, if afforded at all. For schizophrenics, for instance, they are shackled to their bed so that they cannot run away, or shackled to some hoop on the wall. And they believe that this is a way to keep the schizophrenic patient from wreaking damage. Fourth, hospital beds capacities are very low vis-à-vis the increased epidemiological risk of the area. Rudimentary vaccination programs have just started being implemented, but there's a severe shortfall in infrastructure and support. 6, a major problem in planning for health care services is that we don't have censuses of the peoples in the rural areas. 7, related problem is a lack of roads and communications and infrastructure. And 8th, in Sub-Saharan Africa and Cameroon in particular, the health care system recognizes metaphysical aspects to disease and illness, namely that they're the work of evil spirits that need to be placated with various rituals. Let me give you a rundown of some incidents so you get an idea of what we're talking about. First, the countryside. When I found myself in the desert populations of northern Cameroon, here's a diary entry I made. We have women arrive from dawn with their sick children, malaria, diarrhea, respiratory problems, and many other issues. And we have nothing except for some painkillers and antipyretics. It's difficult not to be able to do. I just read the blessing and made the sign of the cross over them. I picked the most difficult cases and I suggested we should go to the closest hospital 50 kilometers away if we could make the drive without going around the lake. Otherwise it would be 100 kilometers. So we went by car, and luckily the lake had dried up, so that saved us 50 kilometers. After 2 hours of a very difficult drive in the sand, we reached Yagua, a town in the sand, literally. After the formalities, we had the little patients examined, bought medication, and with the help of our interpreters, instructions were given by the doctors to the ladies. On the way, I asked, had they been to the hospital before? And they said it was the first time in their life that they were visiting that town. The following day, her mother brought me her little one with very severe burns. When I untied the bandage, which was really a rag, I was horrified to see that we could almost see the patella of the little boy, and the entire burn was spread with an ointment made of ash and palm oil. It was impossible to clean the wound. We had to go to the hospital again. That was another 2-hour drive under 50 degrees Celsius. And at dawn the next day, we were brought the bad news that a child near the mission had died of high fever. Not even the children had realized the child was suffering. They thought it was just malaria, and it was buried the same morning. Then we left for the parishes in northern Chad. As we crossed the border near Fianga, the first town, we saw a father with a child in his hands running, and two women running behind him, desperately crying, lifting their hands to heaven. They were coming back from the doctor, and during the doctor's exam, the child had died. It was indescribable, perhaps more reminiscent of an ancient tragedy than anything else. Sunday, late in the afternoon, everything had turned into a pond because of the continual rain, and suddenly we had to stop because our steering array had broken down. So we took it to a makeshift mechanic, and we saw a bicycle approaching us in difficulty because of the water and the mud. The bike was driven by an aged man, and he had a lady and her child on her back. She was crying, and I was told in Tipuri, which was translated, "Can you do something, because I found this woman crying on the road. Her child has died, but I can't reach the hospital because of the water." I went up to the child. The head was still warm. It wasn't breathing. I tried to find a pulse. Nothing. For a moment there, I thought that I caught something, but it was in fact the sobbing of the mother that was transmitting a sort of tremor to the child's body. The child had died 12 hours earlier in high fever, but the mother didn't want to believe it. She held the baby bound to her back until the afternoon, when the bicyclist found her. I made the sign of the cross, ready to burst out in tears, and gave some money to the bicycle rider for his pains, and so that he might pay the doctor at the hospital. What anguish, what sorrow. In the midst of all these adversities, however, people have developed a very high level of solidarity and self-sacrifice. It is this solidarity that preserves the Africa of poverty and exploitation and those extreme problems, and that cultivates hope in the hearts of those in pain, those that are suffering. And I think that it conceals a very deep and unimaginable spirituality, the spirituality of suffering Africa. Everywhere, in every tribe, family, village, town, or guild, there are subscription funds of limited capacity, but they are the help that the desperate give to the desperate. They are the funds for the poor, provided by the poor. I believe that this solidarity is what keeps this chaos from turning into hell. And it is our bond, our uniting bond, the common locus from which every effort to evangelize Africa begins. Let me give you two examples of things that happened recently in Yaoundé, the capital of Cameroon, that will make things clearer. All of Africa practically considers abortion to be a sin against the creator of life, against family, tribe, nature, and there is this primeval belief that if anyone destroys a life, automatically they will draw upon themselves all the curses and difficulties in the world. Every child, whether arising out of ignorance or mistake or violence, and of course, by volition, are welcome, and they are to be respected, the source of blessing. It is God who will take care of the children, the God that gives them. I always found those answers I was receiving a bit askew, showing me that there's a different view to things than our Western cultural vantage point. But what you see is that those people don't just believe what they say, they have the courage to stand up for their beliefs. It is not a rarity. In fact, it's rather an everyday phenomenon to see young girls give birth to children. And what happens commonly is that her parents adopt the grandchild, and the girl, who now knows how children are born, continues with school in the hope of a better future. If there are no parents to the girl, then some other relatives will take the child up. However, there are instances where this is not possible, and the girls can't hold on to the newborn baby, in which case they will put in a bag, take it to the marketplace and leave it there. That's where the ladies who sell vegetables and bananas will go at, say, 4 in the morning and will prepare the stand. Now, they are always on the watch out because they know that it's not unlikely that there will be a baby abandoned someplace, and they will directly rush to any crying that they might hear. Usually they agree among themselves who shall take up the baby in her hut, and they have this shared fund out of the proceeds of the trade so that they can pay for the upkeep of the child. Now, there was this day when in the bazaar in Cameroon crying was heard, and a few big mamas rushed to the place where the crying came from, and they found a pair of twin boys. Now, that was the first time it had ever happened. 2 twins, boys. So they gathered round the children in ecstasy, and suddenly this huge fight breaks out because there was those 2 women fighting over the 2 children, each one wanting to take both of them home, and refusing to contemplate the possibility that each would have one of them. Now, this little crowd gathered round, and the police officers of the neighboring police station arrived. They saw what was happening, and they suggested that each woman take one. And this immediately brought altercations. If God created the 2 together, who are you to split them up? You can't do that. And the police officer realized that he would get nowhere with his idea, and then he said, let's take them to the state orphanage. And weren't you brought up by a mother? Did your mother hand you over to the orphanage? Shame on you. That's what men are like. You only know how to sow your children, and you don't care how they will grow up. The policeman realized that he had made a shambles of this, and he wanted to make a more reasonable proposal. So he turned to the women who were fighting over the 2 babies. Well, you already have children, and it's a difficult life for you. Why don't you share them? And the answer of the woman was really amazing. I want both of them because this one will be Cameroon's president and that one will be our prime minister in the future. So who could add anything else? That's the kind of African solidarity we're talking about. Now, here's my second example. There was this day after Sunday liturgy when I was approached by a young man who greeted me respectfully. This had happened some other Sundays when I officiated at that particular parish. So I was curious and I asked him whether his family were Orthodox, and he answered, he was clearly moved, Your Eminence, my parents had been Orthodox, but it's been many years since they died. They were killed at a road accident, both of them, so that left 4 orphans, and our neighbors shared us among them. I was taken up by a Muslim neighbor who helped me through my studies. He was a very special kind of person. He never took me to the mosque. He would tell me, you're not Muslim, your parents were Orthodox and went to the Orthodox church. So every Sunday morning he brought me here to the church and waited outside until the liturgy was over so he could take me back home. And all that until I grew up and I could come here on my own. If I'm Orthodox today, it's due to the justice and respectfulness of this man to my parents and to me, without a doubt. Allow me to give you one more personal experience, to describe one more personal experience so that you can come to have some connection with the reality of this very poor world in sickness. That's in Yaoundé, the capital of Cameroon. Beginning of August, some years ago, during the monsoons, the telephone rings at midnight. I was startled, and I heard a woman I knew who had worked as a cook in the bishopric, and I understood that her daughter was in emergency care at the hospital. I went to the hospital, which were in fact 2 hospitals linked together, and the emergency room was just a circular room with beds and 50 patients, some of them already dead. Quite shocked, I went and I found the cook. I asked her what happened, what's wrong with her. We don't know what's the problem. She lost her senses, and she couldn't walk when she came to. I asked for more information from the nurse, who said we need to run some tests. We can't tell what's wrong. Don't pay attention to what the mother's saying. There need to be some tests, and we need money for that. The mother has no money, nothing can be done. So I paid for the tests and waited for some time, and at some point the nurse came and told me rather coldly, the patient is an AIDS sufferer, HIV positive. She urgently needs blood transfusion. What a shock. Now she went back to her post, and then she came back to me and said, we don't have her blood group in the blood bank at the hospital. Perhaps you can find donors or some blood with another blood bank. With God's help, I found out where to look. We went to an intern who undertook to accompany me in our round of the hospitals, and we found some blood at the 4th hospital. We began the transfusion when we went back, and the patient woke up and she started crying, "Don't let me die, don't leave me alone. I want to get better. I want to get well, and I'll be in church every day. Pray for me. Don't let me die. I tried to calm her down, but what can you say to a 20-year-old young person with very few chances of remaining alive? That gave me some very distressing thoughts. The girl's agony lasted 12 days with continual transfusions, and then she passed away. In her complaint, how she wanted to get better, how she wanted to continue alive. How to deal with such questions? How can you have the courage to turn those questions into critique against our way of life? I think what counts for most is that you should hold on to the hand of a person who's on the verge of dying. And how many are those who have departed this world because no one was found to pay for their medication? According to very ancient traditions, quality, culture, the level of a society, the future of a society is determined by how the society comports itself vis-à-vis life, and particularly the two situations that we describe, the life of its babies and toddlers and how human pain and death is handled. The life of people in poverty and the lack costs the least, if we aren't to say that it costs nothing at all. And so while we are sorely lacking in volunteers and cadres in what we do in this endless hell of the living, what we ought to be doing is to find who or what within this hell is not hell and give it duration and give it the space to exist, according to the words of the Italian writer that we quoted earlier. In Cameroon, and by extension in Black Africa, there is an ongoing struggle amidst tragic circumstances and difficulties, a struggle that it is impossible to be lent the dimension of spirituality, namely that it is the outcome of the sin of those people who are suffering it, when in actual fact you happen to know that it's not at all that. It is the outcome of the sins of the societies of plenty and of societies of consumption. Pastoral care in pastoral health care is unknown there, except for some Protestant hospitals which call everyone to prayer, and there is some sermon that would try to put guilt on patients but also give them some hope. But there is no clergyman that has the prerogative to go into a state or private hospital to exert pastoral care. With Boko Haram, we have seen many soldiers and citizens die or be wounded. As casualties, they are hospitalized in military hospitals. So the Army General Staff has designated priests, chaplains from each Christian confession who have attended special seminars in order to handle pastoral issues and to provide psychological support to victims' families. It's the first time that such pastoral care is afforded to people suffering. Dear delegates, I tried to give you an idea of how things are in Africa. I didn't want to be academic or systematic. I just wanted to give you some snapshots for you to get an idea of the reality of the health situation, of sickness and disease and death in the Black Continent. Perhaps it leaves a bitter aftertaste, but the stance of our African brothers vis-à-vis pain and sickness conceals a deeply spiritual dimension of solidarity and long-suffering. Solidarity and long-suffering that is inconceivable to Western people, but which is the only wherewithal that Africans have to cope with the tragic difficulties and challenges of life without losing their faith in man, from which begins faith in the God-man, the Theanthropos.